Okay, yes, we'd better indeed. Okay. We're still on page 30, but we're about to finish it. We're going to get into domestic ethics tonight, of course, from the word domus meaning a home. And curiously, some of the individual ethics we've considered already. When you think of individual ethics, you think of things that are right or wrong to do as an individual. In domestic ethics, we'll get back into some of them pertaining to sexual behavior, but that arises in the context of marriage, and marriage is part of domestic ethics because it's the basic societal unit. So if you look at the bottom of page 30, we have one minor point to pick up, and it just notes that because man is a rational animal, as such, all human beings are equal. So it kind of goes without saying, but when you think about it, many times people argue for equality of all the races, and they do it based upon the claim that human beings are in the same species. But if you approach the question of species from a Darwinian perspective, it really runs you into a brick wall, because from a Darwinian perspective, you're talking about the biological concept of species, and the biologists can't agree on it. So if you don't really have a definition of species, how do you know whether all human beings are in the same species or not? And then you get into the question of trying to argue that somehow we are essentially the same. But if you do it in terms of activities, the problem is you kind of have to start blinding yourself to the fact that different parts of the genetic pool exhibit different capabilities. You don't even want to go there because people are so hesitant to acknowledge that there could be differences between human beings. And yet, it is altogether too evident. If you're talking about, for example, that all dogs are dogs, they're essentially the same species, and yet, horror of horrors, we talk about some breeds as being smarter than others. Now, nobody wants to go near that when it comes to talking about human beings, and yet, clearly, nobody would argue that a fox terrier can run as fast as a Dalmatian, and yet they're both truly dogs. So clearly there are certain members of the human species who appear to be athletically quite superior to others in different ways. We recognize that. But heaven forbid that anyone should draw from that there could be any kind of essential difference. Worse than that, we recognize that it's possible to do IQ testing, and if you can do athletic testing, the fear is that you may conclude that some parts of humanity may do better on IQ tests than others. It's a very dangerous game for people to play, of course, because you may find out that the segment you're in doesn't do that well compared to others. But all of this, you see, is exactly the logic that was given to us by Charles Darwin, and it's the logic that made racist down through history become racist. It's the logic that was used by the Nazis to claim their racial superiority, the Nordic racial superiority, to any other group. Of course, by the same logic, if you start arguing about superiority of one group to another, this gets you into the also slippery slope of defining humanity in terms of the full capability of human performance. And that's where the unborn get short shrift, the very elderly get short shrift, the disabled, those who suffer from mental impairment or insanity, get short shrift. And this is the logic, of course, that gets us into the whole issue of who shall live and who shall die, even, of course, to the point of making decisions about quality of life, determining whether somebody should receive medical treatment. And of course, it goes downhill from there, as we saw during the Third Reich, or even during the Weimar Republic before the Third Reich. Fortunately, as philosophers, we don't define human beings in those accidental terms. The human being is measured by the possession of a rational soul. Man is defined as a rational animal. And you either possess an intellective, spiritual soul, or you don't. It doesn't matter how smart you are, how dumb you are, how fast you are, how slow you are, young or old, able or disabled. Human dignity proceeds from the possession of the human person having a spiritual and immortal soul and a free will, essential properties that flow from possessing this kind of a soul, a human soul. And that is the true basis of human equality. It is the true basis for society. Genuine society can only be formed between persons able to intellectually, volitionally committing themselves to a contract to engage with other human beings to form a bond, a unit, which may be for the purpose of a corporation or a tennis club or civil society as such, a nation, a country, a tribe, what have you. But anyone who wants to start talking in purely Darwinian terms is begging for real trouble. Of course, the Darwinians will swear, of course, no, we're very liberal about this, we believe in all human equality, but the difficulty they get into, and some of their members get into, you wind up with people like Peter Singer defining human beings in terms of their social acceptability, and therefore being quite willing to put to death even already born human beings as not fitting in with the crowd. So the starting point for our discussion of civil society and domestic ethics is that we're dealing with human beings that are essentially distinct from and superior to any subhuman, purely sentient organisms that we normally call brute animals. They don't like you calling them brutes today because it sounds like you're engaging in speciesism, discriminating against other species that are essentially as good as you are. But that's because from the Darwinian perspective, they are. From the standpoint of Thomistic philosophy or Aristotelian philosophy, they are essentially inferior to us. Okay, so let's go over to page 31. We're going to start talking about marriage. We're going to start talking about the relations between the sexes and what it's all about. Some of this will get, I'm sure, very interesting. Everybody's interested in talking about sex. It always got my students' attentions. But of course, sometimes they don't like it when you're talking about ethics and sex and you tell them there's some things they can't do or morally are not permitted to do. So that makes it a much less interesting topic. On page 31 at the top, we notice, of course, that man and woman, the sexes, indeed are equal as human beings because we all share rational souls, but we are different. We've had an entire generation or two of people trying to tell us there really aren't any differences between males and females, men and women. Of course, I still say I want to see the women's National Football League in action. I haven't seen that suggested as yet, but perhaps they'll get around to it. What is more fundamental is the fact that man and woman are made by God as complementary to one another. It isn't supposed to be a war between the sexes. It's supposed to be a recognition that each brings to the other something that is lacking in himself as a person. So this complementarity is essential to what the social institution we call marriage. Now, some people might ask, why does it really matter? Why is this important? Why is it the subject of ethics as a serious issue? Why can't you just do whatever you want to do in the domain of sex and it just doesn't matter at all? The reason that sex is serious is because it is the means by which the species reproduces itself. It is the essential natural means by which God has ordained that mankind continue. So, short of a nation defending its very existence against some external attacker trying to exterminate it, the next most important matter to it is its continued propagation, its continued replacement of itself. And as I'm sure many of you are aware today, we have a fundamental problem in the world that many nations are below the replacement rate. You have to have, 2.2 children? I've always tried to figure out how do you make 0.2 children. But you have to do that just to keep the society going. And many Western countries, if not all of them, are below the replacement rate. John Stossel did a documentary some years back on ABC in which he documented every country in the world as being below the replacement rate. It was entitled something about the population implosion, because the countries are not only not replacing themselves, but you could calculate at the rate that they're not replacing themselves, that by a certain time, I think they said something like France by the end of the 2200 would be gone. By 2200, at the rate that it's reproducing, it won't be there. The only reason the population of some of these countries are maintaining is because of immigration. But it's not because of the population reproducing itself. And if the immigration doesn't reproduce itself, it'll have the same problem. And besides, you've got to get your immigrants, legal or illegal, from someplace that is reproducing itself. And in Stossel's documentary, he said that I believe only about 5 countries on Earth are actually above the replacement rate. And most of them are in West Africa. That's it. What confuses the daylights out of people, of course, is that within the last 100 years, the young death rate has virtually been wiped out in advanced countries. So people are getting born. Used to be they died before they were 10 years old, most of them. Now, because we've overcome infant mortality statistics, which were appalling, people are born and they're growing up. So we have an entire segment of, you could call them baby boomers, that have been moving through the world population, but believe it or not, they're going to start dying. And when they start dying, if they haven't been replacing themselves, what you have is a temporary population bulge, which of course will cause the total population of the earth to continue to increase, but only to a certain point. Beyond that point, you will start getting diminishing returns very rapidly. And you'll have an aged population with no young people to replace them. Indeed, if you look at the population of the Soviet Union, or Russia, whatever you want to call it now, in the last 40 years, I believe it was something like 200 million Russians, or Soviets, about 1960. Now the same population group, just to avoid the geographical criteria that one might raise between Russia and the Soviet Union, the same population group is 160 million. They've lost 40 million people. I mean, that's pretty horrific. And of course, the difficulty is once you get people to stop reproducing, how do you turn it around? You can put all kinds of incentives out, but it just doesn't seem to work that way. And of course, if you're living in China, you not only don't have a brother or sister, but if the one-child policy is effective, you don't have any cousins. Talk about coming alone into the world. But the reason that sex is serious is because it has to do with the very reproduction and maintenance of civil society. So it's deadly serious. It's as serious as going to war or not going to war, because you're talking about the very continuation of the population itself. And we're concerned also with the question of what is according to nature. What does it mean when we talk about sexual perversion? Can you have perversion? Of course, today people talk about sex as anything you want to do, so nothing is perverse. The idea of perversion means somehow to turn away from something. Well, to turn away from what? It means ultimately to turn away from nature. So we have to examine what is nature, what's the nature of man in relation to this institution we call marriage. And is marriage a natural institution? Well, of course, it has always been held to be a natural institution. Some have said that it just somehow, in an evolutionary sense, developed. But the problem is, anywhere we can go back and check in all of the records in the past or anywhere on earth, we find a normal marriage of one man to one woman has been the norm, not the exception. Anytime you find some kind of a variant of it, you find that underneath the variant, it really still reverts to the norm. So the natural, normal, expected condition of man is marriage between one man and one woman. Always have to watch the difference between normal and common or frequent, because today many people think what is normal is what is frequent. But that isn't the measure of normalcy. Normalcy is measured by nature. And a very simple way to prove it, everybody knows you shouldn't be uncharitable to other people. That's not natural, it's not normal, but it's natural and normal in the sense that it's frequent. Everybody knows that we have a terrible time being charitable. And most people find themselves being uncharitable a lot of the time when they wish that they weren't. So it's extremely frequent, but that doesn't make it normal in the sense that it's the norm that should be adhered to. So when we're talking about what is normal, we're talking about what is natural, how things ought to be, not how they de facto are. Point number D on page 31. Being seeks unity. I mean, to go back to metaphysics for a second, a being is one. A being is being insofar as it's one. We count things by their unities. So we, for example, in this room, there's some 18 human beings because we represent existential unities, and that's why we're able to count ourselves according to the species to which we belong. You can't, technically speaking, count beings as beings, but you count beings as falling under a certain form. So that's why you can't count apples and oranges as apples and oranges, but rather as fruit, because they have something in common. So being naturally seeks unity to achieve being. This is true even in terms of sexual love. Sexual love leads people to seek union with one another. Physical union and union of emotion. That's why it says affective union. A union of love, union of their bodies, ultimately, but also a union in every other way that is possible. Love, when it's properly expressed, seeks as much unity as possible. As I believe it was Cicero said, "My friends are those who think like me." And therefore, hopefully, you want to have the greatest possible unity with your spouse. Where you have disunity, of course, you have a foundation for argument and discord. And you don't want that. You want harmony and agreement, and that's why in the most basic philosophical principles and religious beliefs, you want as much unity as possible with a marital spouse, because to the extent you don't have it, there will be heartbreak and disunion separation, possibly anger and argument. To determine what is essential to marriage, we try to seek a definition. And a definition is measured in terms of the end of that towards which the thing defined is oriented. The definition we come up with, you'll notice there are 5 parts to it. First, it is a permanent union, and we're just going to define it, we'll defend it later on. It's a permanent union, not temporary, of B, a man and a woman. That gets harder every day to explain to people, but that's still the case. C, legitimately formed. It's got to be legitimate. D, for, and here's your purpose, here's the end, the procreation of children. And E, of the education of those children. And the most important of those 5 elements that one has to keep in mind is the procreation of children. Oddly enough, but remember, what we're talking about is the natural institution by which society procreates itself. So the focus of this institution, the end of this institution, has to do with procreation. Everything that we're going to learn about it has to do with procreation. As much as people today try to separate it from procreation, we will come to see why that really doesn't make sense and doesn't work. When we talk about the education of children, we're talking about raising them up to maturity. Physically, they have to be given nutrition. They have to be, you got to feed them. Once you got them here, you got to feed them well, take care of their health. You have to help them to develop psychologically into well-balanced, mature human beings able to take part in society. And you must give them moral education. You have to make sure that they are formed properly in the virtues and not the vices. It's easy enough for them to learn the vices, but you have to teach them the virtues so that they will be able to function well as human beings in society, not merely physically, not merely socially, but also as oriented towards their last end. In other words, they will be not only clever, but good human beings in the moral sense. Point number 1 at the bottom of page 31. Marriage is a permanent union. And the basic reason it has to be permanent, well, it's probably more than one basic reason, but if it's the institution through which procreation takes place in society, then you're talking about producing what Dr. Waters used to call new live man. But when you say new live man, it doesn't mean new, like a baby. It means a fully functioning human being able to function well in society. Human beings are not born that way. Therefore, they need maybe up to 21 years of development in our society before they reach that point. So that they have to reach this physical, psychological, physiological, and moral development so that they reach the point at which they are able to function independently of the family. That means that the union between man and woman has to be permanent. Now, question one might ask, well, how permanent? It's not a transient thing, clearly. Of course, the problem is if you think about it, by the time your first child is 21 years old, if you've been living together for 21 years, and if you have been continuing to operate according to nature's law with reference to procreation, it's just possible you might have some more. So by the time you've had the first one and he's 21 years old, you might have some younger ones who are not 21 years old. So this permanent union is going to have to be more than 21 years. It's going to have to be maybe 31 or 41 years, as the case may be. And not only that, of course, but you then have a relationship and obligation not only to your children, but to their children. So that to have a natural relationship, this is an ongoing process of family building, unlike what we are used to thinking of today. And of course, then you come to the point of, well, if you've served all this time together, I hate to put it in those terms, but at this point, all right, then you're going to say, okay, it's time that you can go running off because you've fulfilled your obligation. Well, the difficulty is, how does this leave the participants? Are they equally well off? I mean, by that time, they may be 60 or 70 years old. You're going to dump them because you find some other person that seems more interesting, and you may be leaving them. They may no longer be that marketable a quantity themselves. I mean, you can begin to see where justice comes into play, that anybody who wants to replay the rules and redress them at a later point in time is really being extremely unjust to somebody else. But there's another issue here. There's another deeper reason behind this, as we will come to understand when we talk about what the nature of the contract of marriage is, because it entails a certain type of activity whose exclusivity would never allow you to engage in that activity with somebody else. You have to understand what it is you are contracting to do when you get married. What does it entail? And the nature of what you are contracting to do has a bearing on the question of permanence. But we'll take that up a little bit later. On page 32. Did we get to 32? Okay, well, I'm going to sound like a genius then, because you would have the notes in front of you. Point number 2, it must be legitimately formed. That means that you have to have proper matter. Now, proper matter means that the two individuals who are getting married have to be fit to get married. They have to be, you can't marry your TV set. Of course, this is the problem today. We have society saying you can marry anybody. And of course, one of the tremendous difficulties of the logic of same-sex marriage is some people have said, well, if you can marry somebody who's your own sex, well, why couldn't you marry two people that's your own sex? Or maybe 3 or 4, or where indeed do you draw the line? What's the point of a line? Of course, the ultimate logic I've always thought was, if one claims that you're going to be given the same rights as heterosexuals who marry, no, you're not talking about the same rights. Everybody's already got the same right, which is the right to marry a person of the opposite sex. Everybody has that right. What homosexuals are asking for is the right to marry somebody of the same sex. See, that's not the same right. They have the same right everybody else does. They could marry someone of the opposite sex. That's the right that we have. You have the right in nature to marry somebody of the opposite sex. They've always had that right. They don't want to exercise it, whatever the reason. But that's why when they say they want the same rights as everyone else, it's not the same right. The right that has always existed is to marry a person of the opposite sex. It has never been to marry a person of the same sex. That is a novel right. And indeed, as we shall see, it's not a right at all. Because a right, remember, is the moral power to fulfill an obligation. And the obligation that we will see entails having children. And the natural institution for having children is not two people of the same sex. So this is a completely misconstrued argument. Again, part of the difficulty, as I mentioned in the last class, is the moment you begin to take seriously the claims of those who want to have marriage between something other than a man and a woman, you've already entered Alice in Wonderland. You've gone through the looking glass, because it is self-evident to normal people that woman and man are made for each other. If that is indeed if that's a debatable issue, you've already lost the battle. And I think anybody who's honest about it, intellectually honest about it, recognizes that that is self-evident. It's not something you have to demonstrate. Maybe 1% of the people would be so insane they would deny it. But anybody who's being completely honest recognizes we are endowed by our Creator with an inalienable urge to marry someone of the opposite sex. Most everybody. And if you don't have the urge, at least you recognize that's what we're made for. Biologically, psychologically, and so forth. So the moment that you challenge that self-evident fact, you've already lost the battle in terms of the argument, I dare say. You're going to get onto other things, but they're secondary. They're secondary. This is not a debatable issue because it's a first premise. You don't debate first premises. If you cast the first premise into doubt, you've already lost the argument. All right, so proper matter. That means a man and a woman. 2 men? No. 2 women? No, because they don't achieve the end. Not by any natural means. No incest. You cannot have consanguinity which is too close. You can't have a mother marry a son or a daughter marry a father. Again, that's self-evident to most normal people. It is actually more natural that a brother marry a sister than to have a parent marry a child. But saying it's more natural doesn't make it natural. Clearly, it is partly because of concerns about genetic difficulties which will cause damage to the offspring, not the least of which was noted in the royal families of Europe. Remember, they all suffered from hemophilia. Big problem because everybody was everybody's cousin or closer. A very serious problem. But even prescinding from that, the natural institution of the family requires that people who are living together not be sexually active with each other because children have to grow up in peace without being disturbed by this kind of interreaction between themselves and their mother or father or siblings. They have to have their innocence, their intimacy protected during that period of time. And therefore, society has always had strong laws against this kind of marriage. It is possible that second cousins, or in some cases, the church permits dispensations even for first cousins, but not closer than that. It's kind of odd. I was reading a book not long ago about some Portuguese families, diplomatic families around 1910 to 1920, and the amazing thing was everybody was marrying his cousin. I just noted everybody was marrying his cousin. This was Portugal at the time, which clearly was quite Catholic. Therefore, they must have been getting dispensations like crazy. That's all I can figure. But everybody was marrying his cousin in these families. They didn't explain how this was legitimized, but I presume that it was. Sister?
Is it legitimized by like a third cousin or something?
No, these are first cousins. Okay, absolutely. They were first cousins.
Right. But would it be legitimate if it were third or fourth cousins?
Oh,
I watched this
yeah. If you
Downton Abbey, and everybody has the same name, and they refer to them as cousin, and yet there are relationships.
If you get far enough away, I don't know where the line is. It's extremely complex. I'm sure you've seen the tables, yeah. Because it's it's a Chinese puzzle. But if you could get a couple cousins away and get off the bloodline a little bit, you're home free. But I mean, this was the whole problem, if I'm not wrong, and I'm sure some of you can correct me, between Henry VIII and his wife, Catherine. Do I have the?
The first one?
The first one, yeah.
Because he married
Is that
his
Catherine?
brother's wife.
That was his cousin.
That was his cousin.
And he obtained a papal dispensation
For political reasons.
to allow, well, he got the papal dispensation to marry her, and then after being married to her for a while and finding out she wasn't bearing any male offspring, his conscience started to bother him. And hence the beginning of the Anglican Church. But at any rate, okay, so no incest, no prior marriage, because if you got a prior marriage, the person's already married, and therefore they're not capable of entering into the contract of marriage. Not insane. Of course, some people would say you have to be, but that's only the cynic. The insane cannot marry because they're not able to give the full consent which is required to so serious a matter. They have to have reached the age of reason. If they haven't reached the age of reason, again, they can't give consent. In canon law, I believe it's 14 for females and 16 for males, or whatever the prevailing rule of the country is. They have to be sober. You can't get married when you're drunk. You cannot have impotence. That is, basically, the two parties have to be able to perform the marriage act. They have to be able to engage in sexual intercourse. If they're physically incapable of doing it, then they're incapable of getting married, plain and simple. Don't confuse that with sterility. You can be sterile and get married, but you cannot be impotent and get married. Sterility, all that you're guaranteeing is that you will engage in the acts that are capable of producing children. You are not guaranteeing that you will produce the children. See, that's the difference. Sterility has to do with assuring the outcome. Impotence has to do with performing the acts that are ordered to the outcome. You have to have the latter, you do not need to have the former. Now you have to go back and untangle what I said. You cannot have a mistake as to person. In other words, you can't, you may think you're marrying Sally, but in fact it's her twin sister, Alice. So you didn't marry the person you thought you were marrying. This is probably more dangerous if you marry by proxy. I don't know. Yes, you can get married by proxy.
Yeah, I just heard that the other night.
Yes, you can do it.
It was a military issue, but I thought they said it was only permissible in the military. But this guy and his wife, that somebody knows directly, are having marriage by proxy.
Yeah, it can be done. But you got to be sure, make sure you get the right proxy.
Video streaming.
And there are other things that pertain to the matter, but the point is the people who are going to get married have to be fit to get married. They have to be in a situation which allows them to do it. Edwin?
What about disparities in age?
That, I don't think that's absolutely essential as long as both are of the age of reason, which is normally taken to be puberty. I mean,
So there's nothing, from an ethical standpoint, there's nothing wrong with
I don't think you
a
could.
45-year-old marrying a 13-year-old?
Well, you'd probably have to be 16, at least, for the male, 14 for a female. But no, I don't think you could a priori say it's not allowed. It may be very badly counseled, there may be, all kinds of objections, and properly so, but to say in principle it can't happen, I don't think you could say that.
So then if you had two older people, like let's say they were in their 60s, they couldn't get married because the woman couldn't produce a child?
No. That's why I was trying to explain the difference between impotence and sterility.
Right.
They can be sterile from day one and still get married. And we'll emphasize more the distinction as we proceed. We get more into the sex of it, just to keep everybody's attention. Society, you might ask, why is it that civil society demands that a marriage, which would be the right between two individuals, why does civil society have the right to regulate it in the sense of demanding that it be recorded, registered publicly? The reason that civil society can do this is because you have to know who's married to whom for purposes of legal inheritance. You have to know who's married to whom to prevent bigamy, for example. There may be other reasons, but that's why, you see, you get into a very curious situation here, because marriage is between two people. They marry each other. It isn't the priest or minister or town clerk that marries them. They marry each other by their willful consent, as we will see. But then you might ask, well, then why does civil society have anything to do with it? Well, I just explained partly why. But then you have the further complexity that it's also a religious matter, because Christ raised marriage to a sacrament. So that's where the church gets involved. And there are absolute rights that belong to people that flow from the fact that they are existing within a religious dimension. So this gets very complex, to say the least, and we obviously can't go into all the complexities, but you can see why civil attorneys and canon lawyers have a field day dealing with these issues, because of their complexity and the seriousness of their implications. I assure you, I am neither a civil nor canon lawyer, so we're not going to go too far this way. We need marriage to replace the race. It is essential to society. It is not just a contract, but it is a contract between two people. It is not just a contract, it is an essential element of society. Marriage is the basic social unit. It is the basic natural unit upon which every civil society is built. And those societies, of course, some totalitarian regimes have attempted to deny natural human rights by abrogating and regulating and destroying the family and marriage to the extent that it can do it. And this, of course, is the same thing that we're dealing with right now in our society, with the attempts by the present American administration to interfere with the natural religious rights of people who are objecting in conscience to some of the programs that are now being advocated or have been made into law to force people to offer their taxpayer dollars, or possibly even to cooperate with the administration of contraception and or abortifacient drugs or abortions. Here you again have to be very concerned about the relationship between civil society and the individual conscience, not only in the matters I just described, but also in terms of civil society interfering with the natural rights of people to marry and the rights of people to retain their religious values within the context of marriage. This gets very sticky. Sexuality. Well, it says here touch. Well, it of course does, because all of the senses, in a certain sense, arise out of the sense of touch. And of course, when people fall in love and want to marry, they want to touch each other. And, the first thing you do is hold hands, and it's all downhill from there. I mean uphill, whichever way you go. But, it takes great courage to make that first movement. And will she notice my little finger touching her little finger or not? And but obviously, people naturally seek closer and closer union. Ultimately, of course, this results in sexual intercourse. And of course, then the problem becomes, well, is this a totally unregulated process in terms of reason? And because of the seriousness of sexual issues and the outcome of sexual contact, reason has to prevail, and we have to be concerned about what are the natural safeguards to assure the protection and rearing of the children, which are the natural outcome of the end process that we are describing. Touch, of course, has many functions which are not sexual. As it says here, you can ease somebody's depression or comfort or something, comfort them by giving them hugs and so forth. So touching is not necessarily sexual, definitely not, but at the same time, it can become so, and that, of course, is our concern here with reference to marriage. And that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Everything we're talking about, got to remember, God made the sexes. God made sex. God, even in the Garden of Eden, told Adam and Eve to go forth and multiply. And the rabbits were listening very carefully. I always love that cartoon. I don't know if you've seen it, where they show an underground rabbit warren, and they show a teacher up in front, teaching all the little bunnies how to multiply up on the blackboard. It's really cute. Marriage is a contract. And by the way, when you talk about what the state can do in reference to marriage, because marriage is a natural right, the state does not have the right to absolutely prohibit it, not even in the case of disease. Not even in the case of disease. For example, they may be able to regulate it by saying you have to have certain tests done to know if you have sexually transmitted diseases. I would say they certainly have the right to inform the other party if you do, because people sometimes lie about these things. So that's within the proper domain of the state to regulate. The state could even regulate to the extent of saying you may not marry for a certain length of time until we cure your disease. But for the state to say you absolutely cannot marry because you have a disease, if both parties are well informed and choose to proceed, the state does not have the right to prevent them from so doing. Because you're talking here about a natural right.
But the state is the one that performs the marriage.
The state does not actually perform it.
Well-
Anybody who, a state or church witnesses the marriage. The
Right.
people perform the marriage.
Right. But don't you have to do that? You're saying marriage is a right that the state can't say no to?
That's correct, ultimately.
So you could go out into the field and marry someone, but that's not acceptable in the state.
Well, I said the state has the right to regulate. Now, one of the rights that it has to regulate is to register the marriage, and registration entails having a witness. Now, that witness may be your local Catholic priest or Protestant minister or rabbi, but he's going to be a witness, and you'll notice when you get married, well, you haven't, sister, but when you get married, you'll notice on the form that the priest fills out, it's a state form, if I remember correctly. It's a state form.
It's the same thing if you want to do an annulment. They will not grant an annulment or begin a process unless you get a divorce, a civil divorce.
Well, that may be. And I told you the complexity of the interrelationship between these things. So the state has every right to demand a witness. But of course, the fact is, if you're, when I say it's a natural right, if you're out in the boondocks somewhere, let's say 200 years ago, and there's nobody around that can marry you, and you're not going to have anybody around for 6 months, you can marry each other. And it can be a perfectly valid marriage.
Philosophically speaking?
No, really speaking. Sacramentally speaking,
Okay,
yes.
that's
Okay, you wanted theologically speaking, didn't you?
fine.
Okay. The contract of marriage. Now, I always love this when you ask people this. What does it mean to get married? What are you doing when you get married? Well, I know you get a lot of smart answers, but what are you actually promising to each other? Yeah, everybody says, well, we're going to love each other, we're going to live together, care for each other, cherish each other till death do us part. And of course, that's why people of the same sex say, we can do that. We can do all of that. And then you ask, well, what's the difference? What is the essence of marriage? You can ask, 95% of the people, married or unmarried, and they haven't got a clue. They did it, but they don't know what they did. Now, of course, they really did it because they did what they thought everybody else did when they got married. So if you were doing that, you got married. But what is the essence of the contract? What are you promising to the other person? There's only one thing that you're promising. Some people say, well, you only married me for sex. Well, guess what? You did. You did. The contract of marriage is simply this. Everybody's shocked when they first hear it. You are promising to this other person that you will engage with them in those acts that are procreative. That's the essence of what you've guaranteed. Everything else flows from it. All those other essential properties, they're there. But that is essentially what you have guaranteed to the other person. And that's why you have a serious obligation anytime they request it, assuming they're sane and not drunk. You have an obligation to consent, because that's what you have offered to give. I know that there's a lot of people don't know this, and they don't live up to it, and they don't do it, and they get headaches. But that is essentially what you have promised. That's the essence of the contract.
I like this stuff. So the person with the disability, wheelchair bound, he can't make that promise.
And the question is one of impotence. You haven't, remember we said you can't be impotent. You have to be able to engage in those acts which are apt for procreation. You don't have to be able to procreate. You don't have to guarantee the outcome, but you have to be able to engage in those acts which are oriented to that outcome. If you're not able to do it, you're not able to consent to the marriage contract. And that is the essence of what is being contracted. And if you try to define it, good luck. Any other way, you'll find out that you'll wind up being able to marry your TV set or your pet dachshund or anything else that comes into your perverted mind. Because there's no other way logically to define it. Like I said, anybody you can promise to live with your dear sibling, not sexually, but you're going to take care of each other the rest of your life, love each other, share your roof and your food and everything. That doesn't make you married. It doesn't mean you're engaging in those actions that are specific to marriage. Marriage is all about sex. I can see, even to those of you who are married, some of you would find this a little bit shocking.
Does that
Sure.
negate artificial insemination, doctor?
Well, that gets into the question of, yeah, we got to save that one. that gets into the question of what kinds of actions are permitted to those who are married or not. But the essence of the contract, what you are contracting, is, as it says in your notes that you don't have, it is not for children, but for the means to children. You are contracting to engage in those acts which are the means to the production of children. That's what you're doing. And you try to define marriage any other way, rationally, and get something that's going to work. The reason that...
Etymologically, isn't even marriage taken from some thing of motherhood or something? Am I correct about that?
I'm not sure. You plumbed the depths of my ignorance and found some.
Is exclusivity part of that?
Those things will come. Those things will come. There's all kinds of essential properties of marriage. And what most people think of when they think of marriage, they're thinking those properties. They're thinking of all those things that come with it. You'd say, well, I'm not going to contract with somebody just to have sex, to have children. I don't even love the person. Well, don't marry them. You're out of your mind to marry somebody you don't love. You need love. You need suitability. You need harmony of temperament and beliefs and all these other things that go with it. You need to like the other person. They need to turn you on. If they don't marry them, because boy, you're getting into a bad situation. All of these things have to be present. They should be present. But they flow from this essential finality of the contract. That you have agreed with this person to live together permanently so as to engage in those acts which will be open to new live man. And all that goes with it. And you would indeed be insane to enter into this if you don't have all those other pieces together.
So is it lawful to decide within a marriage to not engage in sexual activity to avoid procreation?
Yes, you could do that for a very serious reason. It's possible. But
Has to be mutual.
But it has to be by mutual consent. Because you to have gotten validly married, you have to have given the consent to those acts. After being married, you might, for some serious reason, mutually agree to lead celibate lives. That could be licit. I believe that Jacques and Renée Samaritan, when they were first married, were living celibate lives until some priest told them, that really isn't the reason you got married. I mean, it's a little bit odd. People may for serious reason do it, but just you get married and then you're going to live celibacy, you kind of missed the point of what you were doing. Why did you do it in the first place? But that it is still possible.
Even if the purpose is to avoid having children?
Well, that would be a different issue, because you always have to ask, was that intended before the marriage or after the marriage? If it was before the marriage, you didn't give consent, because you can't permanently intend to be marrying in order to not have children. Not that that would make much sense. If you are once married, it is possible that you might agree not to have children, but you're already validly married. Then it becomes a question of whether it's morally licit to do that. And again, there may be extremely good reasons why you would not want to have children. There might be reasons, for example, maybe one of you does have a terminal sexual illness and not want to convey it to the other person, and you both agree freely to not engage in sexual intercourse. It's not because you're deliberately trying not to have children, but because you're trying to not cause the death of one of the spouses. I would very strongly suspect that it would be morally wrong to will not to have children just because you don't want to have children, because that would oppose one of the primary end for which you got married. I would think that would be morally wrong, yes, if that were your sole motive.
But natural family planning
That's
would
different.
enter into that.
But in natural family planning, you're still having intercourse.
Right.
Eve was asking about if you just choose not to exercise the act at all.
In order to exercise, in order to not have more children or children at all. So it is in a sense contraceptives if you avoid
No.
sexual activity because you don't want to procreate.
It's not contraceptive. We will get into that. You've got to make some very clear distinctions as to what is contraception, what is not contraception. I'm assuming you're talking about two people legitimately married who decide after marriage for some reason that they just don't want to have more children, and therefore they abstain completely. Now, that's why I said you'd have to have a serious reason. Now, if you've already had 10 children, that may be a serious reason. If one of you has a very serious illness, that may be a serious reason. But if the only reason you'd have no children, and the only reason is because you don't want to have any children, that would be, I would say, morally wrong. Okay, let's see where I think we're going to have to stop because we ran out of time.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.